There's always a however in politics. Nothing's ever quite the way it seems, because the people who wrote the Constitution officially hated politics. The people who wrote the Constitution said, oh, we want a government that's free from political parties, from these evils of faction, because we have experience. We are not amateurs in politics. We had our own state governments, even before we got independence from Great Britain. We knew about lobbying before the United States became independent, because we hired lobbyists and sent them to London to represent the colony's interests. We know politics is a dirty business, and politics and political parties should be avoided at all costs, said the framers of the Constitution. The best statement of American political philosophy are the Federalist Papers, written not because we wanted to have a philosophical treatise about politics written. No, this is America. This is a very practical-oriented country. Write the Federalist Papers because we want to influence public opinion about the draft Constitution. And so 3 guys wrote newspaper opinion pieces in the state of New York, trying to get them published throughout the state of New York to influence the decision of the New York State Assembly in ratifying the draft Constitution. And James Madison, in Federalist number 51, basically comes out and says, you know, faction is a terrible thing. Political groupings organized to try to influence the power of a particular group, that is the worst thing imaginable. The only thing that will save us from the evils of faction is if there are more factions. The way to make sure that one group doesn't get too powerful is to have as many groups as possible, so that no single group becomes dominant. So these guys went out and tried to say, our Constitution is the best way to avoid the evils of faction. The 3 guys, Madison, Hamilton, and John Jay, who wrote the Federalist Papers, were successful. The Constitution was ratified. And what did they end up doing? Hamilton and Madison went out and formed political parties. And Jay went on to the Supreme Court and interpreted the Constitution to say political parties are okay. The first Congress that assembled under the Constitution has a real big problem. Debt. Oh, why does this sound contemporary? Okay. So the new government is formed. The problem is, what do you do with the debts of the old government that's being replaced? Do you abandon the debts of the old government, or do you take them on? Do you send a message to the investor classes that it's risky to lend money to the government? Or do you send a message to the business community that we're here to stay? The business interests in the government wanted to take on the debt from the old government. The people who'd been involved in government before said, don't do it, abandon the debt, because the old government was so awful. People who trusted the old government initially sold their bonds at only a fraction of what they paid for them. because they were worried about debt payments. And their debts were bought up by people who were speculating. They were trying to make fast profit when other people needed money. Don't reward them. Just so happens that most people who wanted to abandon the debts of the old government came from agricultural interests in the American South, who had always been in debt. And the people who wanted the debts of the old government taken over basically came from the Northeast. And they were just about equally divided. What's the compromise? The most important compromise was, where are you going to put the national capital? Okay. National capital was then in New York City, simply because it was convenient. It was scheduled to go to Philadelphia next, when Philadelphia was ready for the government to move in. Philadelphia was the biggest city in the United States. Philadelphia said, once they come to Philadelphia and see the cosmopolitan city we have, forget the truck accidents and the wagons. They'll want to stay forever. Other folks said, let's move the capital further south, because the whole country stretches along the coast. The capital should be in the middle between north and south. Move it further south. And so we had a deal. The Southerners got the capital put in what is now Washington, and the Northerners, who had been speculating on bonds from the old government, got the new government to take over the bond payments and guarantee them. Lobbying, special interests, everything you think about is going on right here. And the deal is settled over a dinner between President Washington, his Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, who represents the Southern interests, and the Secretary of the Treasury, who represents the Northern financial interests on this matter, and the deal is done. Okay? Works fine. And things like that worked through most of the 19th century. One final thing to talk about. Last year, there was an expose in the United States. There's a law on the books called insider trading. It has to do with using private knowledge in a way that benefits you as an investor in a company. So if your next door neighbor, who happens to work for Exxon, says to you, you know, we think the price of oil is going through the roof soon, and you go out and buy shares in Exxon on the basis of that information, and you didn't previously invest in the stock market at all, you can be brought up on charges for benefiting from insider trading, and your next door neighbor can be brought up on charges of providing the information to you. Except if you work in the Congress. Why? Because everything that happens in the legislative process is presumed to be public. Okay? And last year, some very diligent economics professors and journalists worked together and looked at the financial disclosure reports that members of Congress are required to file. And they discovered something, that the longer you serve in Congress, the wealthier you get. Because a lot of members of Congress seemed to have a very good track record at picking stocks to buy. And so there was a new law passed last year called the Stop Trade on Congressional Knowledge Act. If you do the first letters, that spells stock, okay? So, designed to prevent members of Congress and senior staff working in the Congress or senior staff working in the executive ministries from profiting from this specialized knowledge that they had because of being in a decision-making process. Guess what? 3 weeks ago, the law was canceled. Why? Because too many people in influential positions in Washington complained about the law. They didn't want the government looking over every bit of their financial activities to see if they were profiting from specialized knowledge. And so the party leaders in both Congresses, both houses of Congress, and both parties collaborated to quietly allow the law to be repealed without taking a vote on which individual congressmen were identified by name. They did it by a so-called voice vote. Nobody is identified as voting for or voting against, just that it sounds like a majority of the people in the place voted yes. We don't know who. Okay? That happens only when both parties agree not to demand an identification vote. And both parties agree to it, Democrats and Republicans. President Obama was officially upset with this result, but his own party leaders in the Congress worked together with the Republican Party leaders to achieve this result. And this is the Congress, of course, where Democrats and Republicans cannot agree on anything. They managed to agree that this so-called insider trading